welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, here in Berlin, with a discussion today on the election season and US foreign policy implications for Ukraine support. This discussion is part of the initiative Road to Election, which is a virtual event series in which more than 25 transatlantic organizations participate in order to inform and discuss the upcoming elections in the United States and topics related to that. So please also check out other events of the series. You can find the link in the chat. My name is Dominik Toksov. I work at DGAP as a research fellow with a focus on US politics and transatlantic relations. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this discussion today. As you might have heard, the US Senate was working yesterday, despite the Super Bowl, and moved forward a bill that includes assistance for Ukraine. That was supported by, I think, 67 senators, including, I think, 17 Republican senators. So the bill might move by the end of the week to the House of Representatives. And when we planned this discussion here, we could not know that the negotiations would still be at such a critical juncture. So it's a good timing, but it, of course, also makes it much more difficult to discuss the US-Ukraine policy at the moment. There are so many open questions, and it's still unclear in which direction this is going in Congress. So I much look forward to the discussion here. One thing that is clear, though, is that the outcome of the negotiations in Congress will have a huge impact on Ukraine and its continuous ability to defend itself against the Russian invasion. And at the same time, it has huge implications for Europe's security and NATO's security as well. And I think it's fair to say that European governments are quite aware that it would be very difficult to provide Ukraine with the military assistance that Ukraine will likely need on their own, at least for some time. And I think Chancellor Scholz, who visited DC on the weekend, also made that clear in a speech. And also, when it comes to political leadership, the US will remain important, despite the fact that, of course, the Europeans have stepped up. Despite the sort of compromise at the European Council, I think 2 weeks ago, where they agreed on the 50 billion euro aid package for Ukraine for the next 4 years, which is, of course, primarily for financial assistance. And also despite the fact that many European countries have pledged long-term security assistance for Ukraine. So where are we now? What is the status of the negotiations in Washington, D.C.? And what can we expect next in this development? I'm really glad that we have two experts on US foreign policy and congressional politics and transatlantic relations today with us, who can explain us a little bit about the situation and what are the next steps to look out for. We have Andrea Campbell-Taylor. Welcome here, Andrea. Andrea is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security, where she focuses in her research on Russia, authoritarianism, and threats to democracy and transatlantic relations. She's also the co-host of the great podcast Brussels Sprouts, and she's previously worked in national intelligence, including at the National Intelligence Council, working primarily on Russia and Eurasia. Welcome, Andrea.
Thanks for having me, Dominic.
And we have Scott Collinane, who is the Senior Government Relations Advisor at Razom for Ukraine, an organization dedicated to building strong US-Ukrainian ties. And in this capacity, Scott works with Congress, the administration, and other institutions to advance US policy to strengthen Ukraine. And previously, he was a founding executive director of the US-Europe Alliance. And before that, Scott, you've worked in Congress in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome, Scott, to the conversation today, too. Thank you very much for taking the time. And unfortunately, Hannah Thorbon could not join the discussion today because she's working in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She had to cancel her participation. She would have loved to join this discussion, but due to the ongoing negotiations in the Senate, she was just not able to comment on these sort of discussions right now. Before we kick off the discussion, a few housekeeping announcements. Please be aware that this discussion is recorded and will be uploaded to our website, the DGAP website, afterwards. And for all the participants, thank you very much for joining us here too. Please also use the chat function for questions to Andrea and Scott ahead, so we already sort of like have an idea what sort of topics you would be interested in. And Scott, I would start with you because I know you follow everything that's going on in Congress really closely. Can you give us a short explanation what has happened in this last week? The Republicans rejected a large legislative proposal that included foreign assistance to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, combined with measures to strengthen border security and asylum restrictions, which was the result of a bipartisan compromise that senators from both parties had worked out in the past weeks. And now all the discussions went back to where we were a few months ago, where everything is about the foreign assistance package, something that you could have had months ago. So what has happened here, and what do you assume will be the next steps in this, in these negotiations?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and good morning from Washington. Good afternoon. Let me answer that question in maybe two ways. The headline is that yesterday the Senate broke a filibuster that was blocking the aid package from moving forward. So the headline is right now there's good news from the U.S. Senate, and the aid package will probably pass the U.S. Senate on Tuesday or Wednesday of this week, probably Wednesday. And that includes the aid for Ukraine, for Israel, for Taiwan, and a little bit of money to address the opioid fentanyl crisis in the U.S. So that's the headline. That's the good news. More broadly, I would think about how to answer this question in sort of two ways. There's a conversation about the Ukraine aid in particular, but there's also the broader context of Congress or U.S. politics that conversation is taking place within. For myself, I first came to work with the U.S. Congress in 2009. So I'm approaching 14 or 15 years of being in or around Congress in some way. And I think what I have said and what I've heard others say, that the level of dysfunction and acrimony in Congress over the last 2 months is probably the worst I've ever seen it. And I think I might even go from dysfunction to really say broken. Congress is not functioning the way it needs to or the way it was intended. Certainly on the House side, we've seen this last year with the first ever removal of a U.S. Speaker, of Speaker McCarthy, after a very brutal battle last January for him to win the speakership and then to have him essentially be fired by his members, only about a half year later, 8 months later. So the House is in a difficult spot, and the current speaker, Speaker Johnson, has the slimmest majority in House history, only having a majority of about 3 members. And due to the internal divisions and fractures within Republican conference, that's not actually a working majority in practice. On the Senate side, somewhat of a similar thing is occurring where Senate Republicans are also fracturing. Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who for years has been an incredibly effective stalwart managing the U.S. Senate and usually finding a way to get his way, has recently had some very serious health challenges and is very clearly beginning to lose control and lose his position. And I think it's clear to everyone that the end of his era of control is quickly approaching. He has been a absolute stalwart in supporting Ukraine and a more forward-leaning U.S. foreign policy. But even within Senate Republicans, he is only able to bring a minority of his delegation along with him. So that's a difficult conversation for Congress. When it comes to Ukraine in particular, this really began last August, last summer, when the Biden administration put forward its first version of a supplemental request for Ukraine. I think the first one was about $25 billion or so. And then the following month, they increased it to $60 billion for Ukraine. And there was this idea that it would make it easier for Republicans to vote for Ukraine if there was a linkage to the border policy. And the administration tried to put forward additional monies to try and secure the U.S. southern border. Republicans seized on this and found that they had a point of leverage, probably for the first time in 3 years on an issue that united rather than divided Republicans. And so they tried to use Ukraine as a source of leverage to get pretty massive concessions out of the Democrats in the White House. They negotiated, for months, not seriously, for probably about 6 weeks seriously, beginning in mid-December. And that led to a pretty sweeping agreement to bring more aid for Ukraine, together with an overhaul of the legislation governing immigration and security on the U.S. southern border. Once that deal was announced, it survived about 12 hours before everyone on the Republican side walked away from it in a shocking, head-spinning, stupefying turn of events that really left congressional Democrats a bit shell-shocked. And essentially what happened was candidate Trump decided he did not like the deal and that he wanted not to have the issue resolved, but to have the issue remain unresolved for the U.S. Campaign this year, for the presidential campaign. And then so that very quickly sent everyone back to the drawing board and got us where we are this week, with the U.S. Senate considering the foreign aid package without the border piece. So it'll pass this week, and then it goes over to the House, where it's very unclear what will happen there. So we're making progress on Ukraine, on getting Ukraine aid passed through Congress, but it's still nowhere near done. And the last thing I'll say in our conversations on Congress, and I've been, in my current role, I've been on Capitol Hill in some form every week for the past year, talking mainly to congressional Republicans about this. And I'll say that I have two general insights or things I'll share. One is that the conversation in Washington, D.C. is entirely divorced from reality of what is happening in Europe and on the ground. There's two different worlds. The conversations do not intersect. Congress and congressional Republicans in particular believe that things in Ukraine are not that bad, that things are not that desperate, and that there's not that much urgency to pass this deal, that if they pass it next year, things are fine, doesn't really make a difference. The other thing they believe is that I think Congress can be the pace setter for events. And there really is not a genuine understanding I would say, for how much Russia, North Korea, and Iran are doing, and how much they are not waiting for the U.S. to act, but they are making steps, taking actions, and doing things, and not waiting for us to decide. And I think Congress still believes that they can be the pace setters, which I think is very incorrect, but that idea exists. Maybe the very last thing I'll say, on a more hopeful, more positive note, there is still a great deal of support for Ukraine on Capitol Hill. I still argue that a majority of both houses, a majority of both political parties, a majority of Republicans are directionally still pro-Ukraine and would prefer Putin lose and for Ukraine to do better. I think that's still safe to say. The challenge is that desire for Putin to lose and for Ukraine to win is hitting up against Donald Trump and the election calendar and politics. And for many members, it is politically safer, less risky to be quiet about Ukraine, not to be very vocal about that, and to try and create these linkages in our legislation between Ukraine and other policy points, be it the border or anything else, that in a foreign policy sense don't really make much sense, but in their individual electoral campaigns helps them. And so this is kind of where Congress is torn. I think many members do support Ukraine. They know it has to be done. But they're also heading into their primaries and then looking ahead to Donald Trump being again the Republican nominee and trying to navigate that in a way in which it does not end their political careers. So thank you very much. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Great overview of the sort of discussion so far. And maybe we can talk about the House discussions a little later on. But before we come to that, maybe one quick question about as you work with members of Congress, if you can explain to us a little bit how the topic of Ukraine has become such an contentious issue among the Republicans, and what are the main reasons for that? I mean, can you pinpoint to a very specific moment, for example, last summer, when you noticed that the mood was changing fundamentally, when sort of border issues, etc., were all mixed into that? Was it all Trump, or were there other factors that came in? If you can just comment on that very briefly.
Yes, briefly, everything revolves around Trump in some way. Every conversation returns to Trump at some point. I would say for how Ukraine became so partisan or so contentious, for me, probably two things. I look back towards the first impeachment of Donald Trump, which was over the Trump-Zelensky phone call. And really, for me, that was the turning point into which, domestic policy and foreign policy became the same when it came to Ukraine and Russia. And where you stood on, if you told me where you stood on Ukraine, I knew where you stood on Trump. If you told me where you stood on Trump, I know where you stand on Ukraine. And, so those two things really became intermixed. And the other factor is a general, what I would say, reemergence of an isolationist strain within American conservatism. Not necessarily the Republican Party exclusively, but within American conservative political movement, in the kind of America First movement that we had in the 1930s and, even into the 1940s in the US, which the Republican Party, which the mainstream establishment Republican Party worked very hard in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s to kind of shove to the side and put in the closet and to put away. And that political force has reemerged. And you could certainly argue today that that has become, perhaps the dominant motivating political force within the Republican Party. And I think many of the talking points and arguments that are used against Ukraine are not terribly specific to Ukraine. And I think it's kind of telling that supplemental combines Taiwan, Israel, and Ukraine. And the opposition is against all of those. There might be some members have some, individual variation, but I think broadly, the people who oppose Ukraine have a vision of a U.S. with a much smaller role in the world, much more limited obligations, and really speak to this idea that what happens in the world really doesn't affect Americans. Much the same way you can say the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan. And as horrible as that was and as badly executed as that was, people here in Washington look around and say that didn't affect my life, that nothing in the U.S. changed when the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan. And so the U.S. can withdraw from Ukraine or from NATO or from trade alliances, and it will equally have no noticeable effect on how the U.S. operates.
Thank you very much, Scott. Really interesting insights into the sort of foreign policy thinking. Anyway, I would like to turn to you. So as Scott has already explained, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty right now with regards to funding. And so what do you think it would mean for Ukraine if the new funding would not go through Congress? And maybe also, what are the other options for the administration to go, to sort of deal with that situation? For example, I think there has been a lot of discussions about the reallocation of funds from the defense budget, but are there really serious options for the administrations to move ahead without further funding? And what happens to Ukraine if the funding doesn't go through?
Yeah, great question. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. Just to maybe take a broader lens on the question, I think right now in Washington, D.C. and in many Western Europe, in European capitals, there's this perception, or at least this prevailing narrative, that the war is a stalemate. And obviously the major economist op-ed from General Zaluzhny gave a lot of credence to this idea. But I think it's first wrong, and it's also unproductive, and it's been incredibly unproductive to the conversations that are happening in Congress, as Scott said, where there's this perception that, we can wait to do this later, things are stalemated, it can't get that bad. But this narrative of a stalemate, I think, is incredibly misguided. And it is true that there hasn't been any significant change in the front lines for many, many months. But we have to recognize that President Putin's goals and objectives in Ukraine have not changed. And rather than it being a stalemate, I think 2024 is actually quite a critical year, because both sides are essentially in a race to rebuild their offensive capabilities and their capacities. And if there's any break or any stalling or any tiring on the part of the West, then it provides an opportunity and space for President Putin to make progress towards his goals, which continue to be to subjugate all of Ukraine. And so it's really important for us to recognize that without the funding from the United States in particular, that will create an environment where Putin can make more significant progress towards these goals. We know right now for Ukraine that ammunition is a major problem. There was just an article out by the Financial Times just on Friday that talked about the fact that Ukraine is only firing 1/3 of the shells that they need to maintain their defensive positions. The Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Umerov, came out and said that in his view that the Ukrainians are being outfired by a ratio of 3-1. But when you talk to other military experts, I think sometimes it's as much as 5-1. And so basically, because of the lack of U.S. support in particular, Ukraine is having to conserve resources that is making it increasingly difficult for them to be able to sustain their front lines. A lack of funding for Ukraine is obviously costing Ukrainian lives. And it is, I think at this point in time, the consensus is that Ukrainian forces are in their weakest position that they've been since kind of earlier in the summer, from summer 2022. Without U.S. funding, there's not enough air defense and there's not enough precision-guided munition and certainly on the fire. So without funding, I think we have to be very realistic that President Putin will continue to make gains. We're already seeing that to some degree. I mean, kind of every week, they're making small gains. It's coming at a great Russian expense. So we have to also be clear that Russia has its own problems and has significant constraints on its capabilities to make any significant gains at the moment. So, but on kind of all along the front lines, Ukraine is really fighting and struggling to maintain defensive positions while Ukraine is slowly making gains near Avdiivka, up in Kherson, and along multiple axes on the front line. So 2024 is really, rather than being a stalemate, I think, and I hope that U.S. Congress and other Western capitals realize just what a critical year this will be. The losses that both sides take, their ability to access outside resources, those types of factors, the things that play out over this year is going to shape the long-term trajectory of this conflict. And the other thing I think we have to, and Putin knows that. So I think that's a really other thing is for Putin recognizes that his picture could look quite different come 2025. So right now he feels very confident and emboldened. He understands that he's just weathered Ukraine's counteroffensive, which was Ukraine's best opportunity so far to try and make progress. So he feels confident that he's weathered the counteroffensive, and he's watching the tiring and the fatigue in some Western capitals over support. So he feels confident in going into 2024. He's got an election coming in March, and so he would like nothing more to be able to demonstrate some gains on the battlefield in the run-up to his election. But I think really critically in the run-up to the U.S. election also to try to show that Joe Biden is a quote-unquote loser, that he's wasted U.S. taxpayer dollars. So this is a really important year for the Russians' perspective too, and they are going to kind of double down and throw everything that they have available at making gains this year because the tide could shift. And I guess we should talk about what happens if the funding comes through. It is plausible that if the U.S. Congress passes this, President Trump is not reelected, things could look quite different for Putin in 2025. The West is really racing to ramp up defense industrial production. So Putin could face a very different picture come 2025. And so again, that's what makes 2024 so critical.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. For the sort of like bleak outlook, but at the same time, I mean, it doesn't have to come that way, right? I mean, funding can get through. So my question would be there. I mean, if the funding really goes through now, and it's over 60 billion US dollars, so that will probably like easily last through the election time and until next year. So what do you expect, Andrea, of the sort of the strategy of the overall support strategy of the US then? Would it be rather geared towards primarily strengthen the Ukrainian defenses, meaning enabling it to secure the territory it holds so far? Or do you think there will be more bolder steps when it comes to military equipment sent to Ukraine, etc.? What do you assume?
So for this year, I think, and this is already kind of out in some press, that the Biden administration is working on their Ukraine strategy in the aftermath of the field offensive. And it really does focus on a hold and build strategy. I think there's broad recognition that in this coming year, Ukraine is unlikely to be able to make any significant advances on the battlefield and has shifted primarily to a defensive position. So all along the entirety of the front, Ukraine is now in a defensive posture. And so if the funding comes through, the funding will go to ensuring that Ukraine can maintain those defensive lines and not give up any additional territory, but then critically and importantly, focus on rebuilding offensive capacity for a more significant push in 2025. And so that means that they have to very critically train new units and reconstitute those units to get ready for 2025. So it's going to be a combination, like I said, of the hold and build, with the expectation that come 2025, they could shift to a more offensive posture. And again, the goal of that would be to convince Putin that this can't go on indefinitely. The goal would be to change President Putin's calculus and his willingness to engage in this conflict for such a protracted period of time. And hopefully, and again, from the very beginning, the Biden administration has talked about putting Ukraine in the best possible position on the battlefield so that they'd be in the best possible position at the negotiating table. And I think that's still where they are. But so for 2024, there's this recognition that it is going to be largely defensive, but building up to something where they could put much more pressure on Russia all across the entire, spectrum. I think it's obviously it's what's happening on the battlefield, but they continue to work on sanctions, the enforcement of those sanctions, all sorts of things. And so there's a recognition that the pressure has to kind of come in all domains to change Putin's calculus about his willingness to sustain this conflict in perpetuity.
Thank you very much. I think a lot to think about here. I would like to shift back a little bit again to the sort of discussions in Congress, because as we discussed, it's not over yet. There has been some progress, but of course, what happens next is if the bill comes to the House, where the situation is much more complicated. As Scott, you already mentioned that Mike Johnson is in a very difficult position, right? He has a very tiny majority. Once the bill moves to the House, what do you expect to happen? And there has been some talks about the sort of called discharge petition. Is that a realistic option, for example, where basically the sort of pro-Ukrainian members of the House would team up and sort of like bring the sort of bill to the floor without the Republican leadership? And if that were really a plan B, what would that mean for Mike Johnson as Speaker? Would he survive such an outcome?
So discharge is possible, but let me back up just for a second. So in the House, Speaker Johnson hasn't been anti-Ukraine. He hasn't been leading the charge, but he hasn't been anti-Ukraine. He understands that Ukraine is an issue which very much divides his caucus. And whatever he does, he is going to anger half of the votes he needs. So it's really a very perilous place for him. For the past few months, he has been able to sort of point to the Senate and say, well, it's all theoretical. The Senate has to act first. We'll decide later on. He's been able to sort of, hide, for lack of a better word. This week, once the Senate acts, all eyes will be on him. And it will be, he will be on the hot seat. It will be a lot of very intense pressure on him from all sides. And at the moment, it's not clear what his plan is. The Speaker has tried, as recently as last week, to move a bill just on the Israel aid as being the least controversial, arguably, least controversial portion of the supplemental, and that failed. And so at the moment, the Speaker seems not to have a plan or really any good options, and a whole bunch of pressure about to come his way. So it's very unclear what will happen. The Speaker can try and move the Senate bill, which will probably pass, but might lead some members of his caucus to do to him what they did to Kevin McCarthy and have him removed. He can try and do nothing and just ignore it. He can also try and write his own bill and write a House bill and send that back to the Senate, something which the Senate will never agree to, but it might be something to do. So it's very unclear. So the factors for him are, how does he manage this very divided Republican conference? He can pass the bill with Democrat votes, but that's not a good look for a Republican speaker. And we also have Super Tuesday coming up on March 5th, if I'm not mistaken, when many of his members will have their primaries. And there's also pressure to kick the can down the road until after March 5th, with the idea that Ukraine is a tough vote and maybe the votes might be easier after some members are past their primary election dates. So there's a number of possible scenarios, but at this moment, I think it's completely unclear what will happen. And I think even in Speaker Johnson's mind, I think he is unclear about what will happen. I think what we've seen over the past 2 weeks is that these things move and change very quickly. And even it's hard to even hold members accountable to the things they said even a few days ago in terms of the commitments they make, or things they say are their red lines, or things that are dead on arrival. It all changes very quickly. And so it's very hard to know what the actual positions are for any of these members, because on this issue, the politics is so complicated. They're constantly in flux. And of course, the biggest unknown factor in all this is Donald Trump. And so far, Trump has not come out directly against supplemental. He said a lot of other things, but he hasn't come out against supplemental. And that's been very good. But that's also, that can change at any time. And Trump can come out and say, Speaker Johnson, don't do this. And then that changes the ballgame again. So it will be very fluid. And there's a good chance this continues to play out over not only this coming week, but perhaps the next 5 or 6 weeks.
Thank you very much. I mean, yeah, the position of Donald Trump in all of this, it's kind of interesting what you just mentioned, that whereas on migration and border policies and immigration, etc., Trump has been very direct, right? But when it comes to Ukraine assistance, you could still see an escalation coming. And we have, of course, the primaries coming up. And I mean, is Ukraine going to be a topic? Like if I were a pro-Ukraine Republican, am I going to mention that? Or is this rather something that I completely leave out? So that leads me a little bit to the question to both of you, basically, how much support is there left within the population, the broader population for Ukraine? Is this something that still, like a lot of people are interested in this? Or do you feel that there's a little bit of Ukraine fatigue, or however you want to call it, that might be detrimental for the long-term support within the United States? I mean, we are now talking about the time frame until next year, right? But in a year's time, of course, hopefully the Europeans have stepped up and, will be able to provide Ukraine with all the aid it might need, most of it. But until then, there's still a lot of dependence on the United States. So how is Ukraine playing out in the US, in the population, but how is the topic also going to play out in the primaries? If you want to comment on that. Henry, would you like to maybe comment on that first?
Sure. I mean, Scott made the point too about there's still broadly strong bipartisan support in the US Congress for Ukraine. And I think that's true for the American public as well. I think generally when you look at polls, people are still strongly supportive of continuing to support Ukraine and send military aid. That has been eroding over the past many, many months. And I think there's a significant divergence also between Republicans and Democrats on their views of how much aid is appropriate. And when we were talking, I was just trying to find some recent polling data on this question, actually. And right now, when you look, there was a Pew poll from December, and I think about 31% of Americans believed that the United States was sending too much aid, which generally means that then people think it's about right or it's not enough. But then when you break it apart along partisan lines, it's where you see really a very striking difference between the two sides. 48% of Republicans believed that we are sending too much aid to Ukraine. So this goes back to points that Scott was making earlier about the kind of partisan nature of this, that a lot of the public does continue to take their cues from Donald Trump and some members of the Republican Party about how to approach support for Ukraine. So I guess it's a little bit of like a good news, bad news story. I would say the good news is that generally speaking, there is still strong U.S. support, but that support is eroding, and it is particularly problematic. I think that it has become such a polarizing and partisan issue, with Republicans growing increasingly skeptical and cynical in their willingness to continue to support Ukraine.
Scott, would you like to add to that?
I think that's exactly right. But I would add to that, when you poll most Americans about, is aid too little, just right, too much, it's a tough thing to poll on, because really, one, you can ask the question, do most Americans really have a good understanding of what our aid is currently doing, and what's their basis for judging it being too little or too much? The other X factor in there is you have to say, or have an assumption of, the aid is too little or too much to do what? Is it too little to retake Crimea? Is it too much just to hold Lviv? And so there's a little bit of ambiguity in those numbers. And I think even in Congress, the sort of the elite level and the general population level of the U.S., there is directionally, most people want Ukraine to win and really, really don't like Putin. Even if Republicans don't want Ukraine to have all this money or to receive this aid, they don't like Putin. Putin is extremely unpopular. And from me, what I see is there's sort of this layer of media gatekeepers, sort of the Tucker Carlsons or the talking heads who have large media platforms, that sort of sit between the general public and the policymakers or the Congress or the elites. And within this strata of media gatekeepers, I call them, that's where you really have some very loud voices that are against Ukraine. And it's a very loud minority that's really controls the bully pulpit and is much louder than their numbers reflect. And that sort of pulls the entire conversation in one direction. And people who are very pro-Ukraine are not very loud about it. And those few people that are really against Ukraine are the ones who just yell about it nonstop. And so it kind of leads to this wrong impression just by looking at who's being quoted or how it's being discussed in the media.
The one thing I'll add to then is, though, it does raise the issue, and I think the frustration by some supporters of this administration, that President Biden hasn't done quite enough to communicate to the American people why supporting Ukraine is a national security interest. Of course, he did the speech, on Ukraine, but it was in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack on Israel. And so it was kind of, you had those horrific scenes, and the president came out and talked about the U.S. needing to support Israel in their moment of crisis. And, oh, by the way, we also need to continue to support Ukraine. So I thought, that was a speech on Ukraine that the president had been intending to give for some time. And then it was interrupted by what happened with the Hamas attack. So there is frustration, I think, here by a lot of Democrats that President Biden hasn't been forthcoming and enthusiastic enough and done enough to explain to Americans why it's in our national security interest. And the other thing with the aid, when we're talking about these dollar amounts, it is an incredibly small percent of the American defense budget. It's something like less than 5% of our defense spending that goes to support Ukraine. And it's having very significant impact, not only on helping Ukrainians defend themselves, but also on deteriorating, eroding, and destroying large parts of the Russian military. And so there does need to be a lot more discourse and discussion, and they're trying to do that, but it has been a little bit too little and too late. And I think that's something that could have been different. There could have been more leadership, I think, from this administration to make the case to Americans to ensure that the support remains.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. I mean, one question that you just mentioned and that I would like to discuss here as well is, of course, the impact of the Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's counter-reaction to that, to what extent that has influenced the discussions in the past months. I mean, it seems a little bit that the Biden administration quickly combined both issues, right? Because politically, it might have been easier to advocate for a large foreign aid assistance or supplemental than having Ukraine on its own. Do you feel like this was an easier way to sell the large package for the Republicans as well? Or how did these two topics intertwine in the past months?
I think, in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack, it made good sense, I thought, to link these two things together as a way to try to ease the passage of the support for Ukraine. And I will say initially, I thought that was a good idea, and it seemed like an effective way to try to secure the funding for Ukraine. It didn't turn out that way, and for all of the reasons that Scott has talked about. And so it has become a much more of a complicating factor. I think the other thing that is often less appreciated is also just the kind of bandwidth that this issue has taken up, particularly in the White House. So you think about the timing. It's part of the reason why, as Scott said, what Congress has been asking for is a strategy on Ukraine. Like, what is it that the money is going to do? What are we trying to accomplish by continuing to support Ukraine? And the White House, the National Security Council, hasn't been able to fully articulate what it is they're trying to accomplish. And everyone had very high hopes on the offensive, the counteroffensive in the late summer and into the fall. And when that failed, there wasn't really a backup plan in place. No one had really done the hard thinking about, well, what happens now? There wasn't really any what comes next. And I think that's where the Hamas attack comes in, is because right at the time, I guess it was a little bit later, you could see that it wasn't going to be effective. But as they would have been ramping up from, the policy process to really figure out what comes next, then you have the Hamas attack, and that has occupied so much kind of bandwidth in the U.S. government that I think it really has stalled the formulation of the what comes next, what's the plan B for Ukraine. So it's been a complicating factor both on the funding side. It turned out not to be an effective strategy to link the two. It's been a complicating factor just from a policy process perspective. And then I think a little bit from the American public perspective, contributing to this sense that the United States is overstretched and doing too much, and that we don't have the capacity or the resources to be addressing all of these conflicts at once. I do think it is fueling the isolationist thinking that Scott was talking about by having the simultaneity of all of these conflicts all at once. I think it makes Americans nervous, and it reinforces that kind of isolationist strain that Scott talked about.
I'll just say I entirely agree, and I think it's interesting to see over the course of the months, how different parts of the package have become politically controversial. So I think if you go back to, say, September, certainly Ukraine was the most controversial and difficult portion of the package, and as time has changed, that's also changed. Where now I think Ukraine funding might arguably be the least controversial part of it. Where the Israel funding causes trouble with the progressives and the left side of the Democratic Party. The border side caused issues with the right wing of the Republican Party, and it actually, I think for the Ukraine portion, it very strangely, not much the conversation, or less the conversation, is actually about the substance of the 60 billion. You don't really hear much conversation about what's actually in it. What does it do? It's very kind of adds to this sort of head spinning kind of effect we've felt over the past few months that things are so in flux and so fluid. It's hard to know, where to step next because things are changing so rapidly.
Thank you very much, Scott. I tried to sort of combine this with one question from other participants here, and I think the question of accountability, right, of the funds. I mean, as you mentioned, like the substance of the sort of the legislation is perhaps not that important to many people, but I think from the Republican side, I mean, they have been at least asking for more accountability and transparency when it comes to the funds, etc. And to sort of combine that with a sort of question from some of the other participants is the question of corruption in Ukraine, right? I mean, that has always been a topic. To what extent do you feel this could derail the whole discussions in the primary too? And to what extent is this sort of like a MAGA talking point, or is it something where you have to be really worried about that? Depending on how the situation goes. Andrea, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. I mean, it is an issue. It is an issue that has permeated these discussions and support from Ukraine from the very beginning. So it is, I think, something that's likely to play a role in the primaries and throughout the campaign. It will be the talking point. It will be something that the Republicans use to kind of curmudgeon and kind of raise doubts about the efficacy and the effectiveness of U.S. dollars in Ukraine. So I think we should expect that it will continue to play a role. Maybe Scott can talk more about this. I think that there was just a report that came out that talked about kind of and documented how military aid was spent. I mean, there are significant oversight mechanisms in place. It's not like we're just handing these funds over and sending them on their merry way. The people have been very careful to build in all of the accountability mechanisms, in large part because for people who want to continue to support Ukraine, they recognize that this is going to be one of the issues that people will try to weaponize in order to mitigate the support. And so I think there's been a lot of consideration and care given to putting those mechanisms in place so that they can demonstrate that the taxpayer dollars are going to good use and what that funds and support is getting to its intended targets.
Scott, would you like to add?
Yeah, thank you. For me, the headline, as Andrea was saying, that there is more oversight and accountability on U.S. aid to Ukraine than there has ever been on any other U.S. foreign aid program ever. And in the political conversation, there are concerns raised about oversight or corruption. And I think a lot of that, you have to look at the intention of the person raising that. Because here I say there are excuses and there are reasons. It is reasonable to be concerned about corruption in Ukraine. It is also reasonable to look at the overwhelming amount of mechanisms, and I won't list them all, but ones that we have put, ones from the international IFIs, ones the Ukrainians themselves have put in place, and say that there has not been major corruption or diversion of Western aid. In fact, we have examples where Ukrainian soldiers have died on the battlefield going back to recover Western equipment so that they can prove it was destroyed in battle and not sold off or anything else. So I think we can say, if people want to listen to reason, the oversight and reports are there that show that to the extent possible, you can do accountability and oversight in a war zone. It is being done, and Ukraine is holding up their end of the bargain. But equally, there are people who use that as an excuse, and there are people who still say, "Well, we have to know where the money is going," and they have been briefed, they have been informed, they have had people from the executive branch and from Ukraine and from other places go speak to them and show them the documents and walk them through the process. And at the end of the process, they come out and they say, well, it's unknowable. It's so confusing. We just can't figure this out. And so I think for this, there's a core of legitimate concern that's right and proper, but there is also a good healthy dose of willful ignorance and people who use that as an excuse. And there's no amount of oversight or accountability that can be put in place that would ever be satisfying to them or convince them that concern has been assuaged.
Can I just add one thing, which is that the corruption issue is really important, and it's important to put these guardrails in place so that opponents of support to Ukraine can't kind of weaponize that issue. But I think it's just, I feel like we haven't done a great job in this conversation of, again, kind of zooming out and talking about why all of this is so important. And just a very quick word on, for Putin, the invasion of Ukraine, I think of it as his point of no return in his larger confrontation with the West. And you can see ever since he's invaded Ukraine that his resolve to confront the United States and to confront NATO has only hardened, and he has fewer options now left at his disposal. And this war in Ukraine and the confrontation with the West has basically become the organizing principle of the Putin regime. It is now how he justifies his regime and all of the actions and the repression that he has taken since the invasion. And he is essentially reorienting Russia around this concept of confrontation. So when you think about, he's reorienting society, they're rewriting textbooks, children are marching and being taught how to fire guns. There's an increasingly fascist online discourse. There's youth army groups sprouting up, tens of thousands of them since the beginning of the war. So he's reshaping Russian society around this idea of confrontation. He's reshaping the Russian economy around confrontation. They've shifted the whole economy now to a wartime footing where they're producing more missiles now than they did before the war. They're outproducing the United States and Europe in terms of ammunition. They're producing their own drones that they were importing from Iran. The economy now is entirely focused around the war. And as Scott mentioned, Russia has also reoriented its foreign policy to double down on partnerships with like-minded partners in Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang. So really this is a point of no return. The German defense minister came out very helpfully, I think, and basically put a time frame on it in terms of when Russia might be able to reconstitute forces and again pose a threat to the rest of NATO. He said it's not going to happen now, but in a time frame of 5 to 7 years, we could find ourselves. I believe it was the Dutch minister who just came out and gave more of a 3 to 4 years. And if you talk about to our kind of Baltic allies and partners, our Northern Europeans, they would say it's in 2 to 3 years. So I think when we're talking about, is there corruption? Are they funneling some of the weapons off? It's so important not to lose sight of the bigger reason that we're doing this, because it's not just Ukraine, it's this much larger confrontation, and we all need to be preparing accordingly.
Yeah, I completely agree. And maybe to move a little bit, maybe also for other participants on this call, if you have a question, please also use the chat function. I see there's a lot of comments in the chat function. If you have a very direct and concise question, please also put it into the chat. I will see this and then pick it up in the conversation here. I would move the conversation a little bit to Europe. And Andrea and Scott, you of course also follow closely what's going on in Europe and what the Europeans are doing. And what would you say are the key lessons for Europe from the current struggles in Congress, right, over new Ukraine funding, or maybe to make it a less of a no-brainer question, which developments in Europe did you find the most frustrating when it comes to support to Ukraine? There's several things about defense spending and long-term contracts with European defense industries, and where do you feel like this is this really frustrates most Americans if they really hear about the sort of lack of progress in some parts of Europe. Whereas there is a lot of progress, of course, but where would you see like this hasn't been communicated well at all? Maybe. Andrea, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's been really good. I mean, and I think Scott and I and others in the transatlantic community really try to double down on the message to demonstrate to Americans and particularly colleagues on the Hill about how much Europe has done to support Ukraine. That total European support for Ukraine now surpasses what the United States has given as a whole. So there's been so much that is so impressive and important. And so, I mean, when you think back to the initial invasion, the reaction of the United States and Europe together, the unity, I think, was more significant than anyone could have anticipated before the invasion. It came as it certainly surprised President Putin, but I think many in our own kind of alliance were pleasantly surprised by the extent. So I think the thing that is really critically important is obviously the defense industrial base. And it is frustrating, not just in Europe, but in the United States, that we're now about at the 2-year mark of the invasion, and we still have not really taken the appropriate steps to increase production of ammunition, tanks, and everything else. So the defense industry, I think piece of it has been extraordinarily frustrating, both on the European side, but also on the US side. We're having the same conversations, the same debates, and the same challenges. So I think it's something that is on both sides of the Atlantic. And then, but I do think it's just the continued investment in defense. And I know that, with the invasion, that many European allies are spending more on defense now than they were before. But it's something that's critically important for that to continue, in large part because, you can hear what President Trump is saying, and I think we should take it seriously. When you hear President Trump over the weekend saying things like, well, if you don't pay, we're not going to protect you, that's a unique possibility. And so I think what I find slightly frustrating is that after 4 years of Trump and kind of all of these indications about the unreliability in many ways of the United States, and it pains me to say it, but that Europeans still haven't done more to continue to invest in their own defense and to build up their own kind of, we could use the buzzword strategic autonomy. And I think there's one scenario that I worry about the most, which is a scenario in which President Putin comes to doubt the willingness and the capacity of NATO to respond to any sort of Russian provocation or attack on NATO. That, to me, is a plausible pathway to a direct conflict with President Putin, that he would come to estimate that the United States just simply would not respond and come to the collective defense of our allies. It could happen for political reasons, the re-election of Trump. It could happen, but the thing I worry a lot about is, if the United States were to be engaged in any sort of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, there are certain types of military equipment, the enablers, air-to-air refueling, certain types of munitions that the United States would then have to deploy to the Indo-Pacific. And those are the types of capabilities that European allies and partners really need to be investing in so that we can maintain a credible deterrent against Putin, even if the United States, either for political reasons or because there's growing conflict or growing tensions in the Indo-Pacific, that we are able to maintain a credible deterrence and defense.
Scott, I would like to also ask you for your opinion on this, and maybe to add one fact about this, or one element on this. One thing that's happening in Congress at the moment again as well is the Repo Act moving through Congress, which would, if adopted, allow the president to confiscate the Russian state assets within the United States. And of course, we know that most of them are in Europe. Do you see this would be like an avenue if Europe would move forward on this? I don't know, to sort of like have some sort of like, like that would be also something that would be in the interest of the Republicans, of course, to secure long-term support for Ukraine assistance. How does this play into that? And is this sort of a topic where you, or maybe to turn around, is this a topic where you can see that this will eventually frustrate people in the US or in the administration, no matter who will be in the administration, that Europe is not willing to move forward on that question?
That's a great example, and is one I was thinking about listening to Andrea. And I think she pointed out in a very eloquent way what I was going to say, much less nicely is I think within the U.S. and perhaps several, if not many, European capitals, we just aren't serious. I mean, compared to what Putin and China and Iran and North Korea are doing, we're just not serious. And we broadly need to raise our level of ambition about what can be done and about not just helping Ukraine not lose, but making sure Ukraine wins. And that's something that many people in the US, even Democrats, supporters of Ukraine, don't always say and have a hard time saying, Ukraine must win. No caveats. And repo is one example of this. And this is, for those not familiar, this has to do with the Russian state assets. So the G7 countries hold about $300 billion worth of Russian state assets that were frozen after the full-scale invasion. And there's been an ongoing debate that should these assets be more than just frozen, but should they be transferred? Confiscation is not the correct legal term, but I'll use it as a non-lawyer. Should they be taken? Should they be confiscated and used to the benefit of Ukraine as compensation for Ukraine to help Ukraine rebuild in the aftermath of Russia's war of aggression? This is an idea which the Biden administration has come to support. This is an idea that has support in several European capitals, perhaps more than several, and most of the G7 countries. This is an area where I think one of the points of tension between Washington and Berlin. I'm very curious if maybe this had been a topic of discussion when the chancellor was here in DC recently, last week. Certainly I think it's something that should be done. The possibility that these resources, that these frozen assets would ever go back to Russia, I think is unthinkable. And I think the G7 leaders have virtually confirmed that. And so now it's a question of what to do. And then there are some exotic ideas around either taking the interest from these assets or using these assets as collateral for loan guarantees. But essentially, all these ideas more or less rest on the underlying principle that these assets can be taken. And we just have not had the courage or bravery ourselves as the Western alliance, as the Western community, to take these assets and use them for the benefit of Ukraine. And I'm actually very confident we will get to that point. But it's sort of like what happened with every weapon system that's gone to Ukraine, from javelins to F-16s, where the answer is no, 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 impossible, 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 until we do it just 2 years too late. And so for me, the question is not, will this happen? I am extremely confident it will happen. It's just, will we do it in a time frame in which this helps Ukraine and creates a deterrent effect on the Russians by imposing meaningful costs? Or do we do this, after the war ends, or at some point when the actual effect it could achieve is much less than what was possible?
Thank you very much. One thing that is not really foreign policy related at all, but it has mixed in, it was mixed in the whole discussions, of course, in the last half year or so, is about sort of border legislation. And Fabio Berwald has asked this question here in the chat. Do you see any border legislation moving forward before the elections? I mean, I think a lot of politicians have said that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to finally get this to Congress, and this has been botched basically in the end. What are your thoughts on this? I know you're not legislation experts on this, but do you see here any potential for compromise on this? Even if the sort of foreign assistance funding goes through, is there any way for a compromise on this before the elections? Maybe, Andrea, would you like to start with that?
I'm going to kick it to Scott. He's our Congress guy.
The short answer is no. That moment has come and passed, and it's probably unfortunate because it probably had more good than bad in it. But no, that is not. I think the odds of that happening are extremely low, perhaps approaching zero.
Thank you very much. There was one more question that I can see when going through all the sort of questions here, and there's a lot of comments here, but about the sort of like NATO deterrence. The statements that we had yesterday, was it yesterday again by Donald Trump in a campaign? Any sort of thoughts on that? I mean, there were a lot of questions about what happens, if we let Ukraine drop, funding drop, etc., what that means for the Baltics. I mean, Andrea, maybe this is a question for you. I mean, the immediate effect on that, if funding doesn't go through that, what would that mean for the Baltics? I mean, potentially not maybe this year, but what do you see? What would be the signal to Putin then? Like, what would he be emboldened to do after that?
I think it's hard to know exactly. And again, I mean, people have made the point that kind of given the degradation of the Russian military, Russia doesn't pose necessarily a challenge to NATO today. But looking out 3 to 5 to 7 years, as many European officials are now warning, it's not a 0% chance. So there is some risk that Putin could come to challenge a NATO member state along Russia's periphery. And again, I think the conditions under which I would worry about that the most would be if you have the re-election of Donald Trump, who casts doubts that might convince some in the Kremlin that the United States would be unwilling to come to the defense of European allies and partners. And so there's a lot of discussion here in the United States. There's efforts in Congress to try to make it more difficult or to prohibit Trump from withdrawing from NATO. The United States Constitution is very clear about what it takes to join an alliance, but it doesn't say anything about how we exit one. And so Congress is trying to put some guardrails on. But as some people have written, and Anne Applebaum in particular has written a brilliant essay about what Trump's reelection might mean for NATO, something like that would likely get bogged down in a lot of legal battles. But just the mere fact of Trump saying that he wants to withdraw, then the damage would already be done. And that's when I think then the risks that the Kremlin looks to challenge a NATO member state. I mean, we talked about, yes, this for the Kremlin, it's first and foremost about Ukraine. But I think it's much larger than that. And Putin is looking to break the European security architecture. He would like nothing more to undermine NATO and get the United States out of Europe. And so if there are conditions under which Putin believes that the United States would not come to the collective defense of Europe, then the risk to, for example, the Baltic states go up considerably. So again, I think it could, as I was saying before, it could happen for political reasons. The re-election of Trump. There's also, growing traction of the far right in many European capitals as well. And even if there's not, the so-called far right wave, it could at least convince the Kremlin that reaching a consensus across Europe about how to respond might be more difficult. So again, it's not just with the political dynamics in the US, but it's also increasing support for far-right parties in Europe, many of which hold sympathetic views to the Kremlin. And then even if US support and for Europe remained resolute and strong, one could still imagine President Putin wanting to test a Baltic member state, test the credibility of Article 5, if the United States is engaged in a confrontation in the Indo-Pacific. There would be, I think, a significant temptation to take that kind of opportunistic action. So again, if this doesn't pass, it certainly if the supplemental doesn't pass, these are the signals that the Kremlin is looking at in as they're forming their assessments of the willingness of the West to stand up to Russia and to take seriously our collective security, collective defense in Article 5. So, I mean, it's troubling for all of those reasons.
Thank you very much, and I understand that there's also a lot of homework for the Europeans in that sense, right? Because deterrence not only depends on the US, but also on European efforts. This was a great discussion. There would be a lot of other topics I would like to discuss with you, Andrea and Scott, but of course we are running out of time. Thank you very much for taking the time to discuss with us today, for sharing your views and your insights. It's always great to get these insights from Washington, D.C. Thank you also for everyone who joined the call. I tried to pick up several of your questions. I hope we've covered a lot of ground here. Thank you also very much to my two colleagues, my three colleagues, Julia, and Laima, for helping to organize this discussion here. And last but not least, also again as a reminder, this discussion was part of the series Road to Elections. So please check out the upcoming events as part of the series. So, for example, on Thursday, there will be an interesting discussion on South Carolina and the upcoming elections. As we know, there will be the primaries there coming up soon, an event organized by the Atlantische Akademie Rheinland-Pfalz. So please don't miss that event too. And with that, I'll let you go. Thanks again for everyone involved. And Scott and Andrea, thank you very much. And I wish you a great day in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, everyone.